I'd like to welcome everyone to our second lecture for the 2018 Public Lecture Series here at MCAD. So the Public Lecture Series is an initiative by MCAD to bring to Manila a host of curators working in the field of contemporary art and provide a place for sharing ideas on curating and the forming of exhibitions within various cultural, historical, and national contexts. No? So the series is a means by which to engage the rapidly growing and quickly changing landscape of the contemporary art here in the Philippines and, of course, in Manila. The series has been and continues to be an ambitious platform to gather throughout the year international curators who work in the field of contemporary art. We invite curators whose thinking and practice we find inspiring here at MCAD, and hopefully will be found inspiring by you, the audience, who've come. Thank you so much for coming. Thinking curators who are reflective and reflexive of their practices and the models they work in, are thinking through the context of the exhibitions they produce within or outside their spaces, and those who have deeply considered the kind of artists and art practices they want to work with. So we have with us, for this second lecture, we'd like to welcome Anthony Huberman, the current director and chief curator of the CCA Wattis Contemporary Art in San Francisco. He comes to us via Singapore, where he just had a curatorial residency with the Center for Contemporary Art, NTU's Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore. So Anthony is the founding director of the Artist Institute in New York in 2010, as a project which was done with Hunter College, where he was a lecturer. And was the chief curator of the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, where he initiated the Front Room, a project space. He has also worked as a curator at the Palais de Tokyo and the SculptureCenter in New York. Anthony has worked with artists like Haim Steinbach, Rosemary Trockle, Jimmy Durham, Joe Bear, and has organized exhibitions with a host of other artists like Richard Archwager, Ella Blastry, Lutz Becker, and Bruce Nauman. He has also written for a host of magazines like Artforum, Afterall, Mousse, and DotDotDot. So we'd like to give the stage to Anthony. Welcome. Just so we have everything clear, after Anthony's talk, we'll have a Q&A. Maybe like 10, 15 minutes, depending on how engaged you become. But in the meantime, let's have Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, thank you for coming. And thanks to Joselina and Chris and Ian and Patricia for inviting me to Manila. It is my first time here in the region, and so it's I've been really grateful to have had a chance to meet people here and learn more about the art and the artists here in Manila. So the title of my talk uses a single word to bring together a range of different ideas. In a way, it's about the S at the end of the word, about mechanisms in the plural, about mechanisms in several different types. It's a word, of course, that's very general and could refer to anything from objects or machines all the way to much larger things like capitalism or government, or obviously to art itself. So I'm going to start from the most general and share a few thoughts on how I've come to understand art itself as a mechanism and how it's informed specifically my own work and my own interest in working with art. And then I'll talk about mechanisms in the sense of tools, machines, and technologies, and how this has informed a recent group exhibition that I curated recently, and then another one that I'm currently preparing. And then at the end, I'll talk about the mechanism that is an art institution, and introduce a few different ways that I've worked to engage with that. So let me begin with a few very big generalities. Here's one: tools that solve problems. I think in general terms, it's fair to say that a tool is invented by someone who wants to solve a problem. Maybe it's to hit a nail into a piece of wood. Maybe it's to drill a deep hole into the ground. Maybe it's to search the internet with simple keywords. Tools don't have to be objects, of course. They can be more abstract things like money, which of course creates a fixed and common system of exchange that can get rid of unreliable and inconsistent bartering. A tool can be something like a law, which is a way to govern large amounts of people under a stable and specific set of commonly held values. Of course, many tools end up leading to new problems, which then lead to new tools, and then new problems, and then new tools, and on and on. However, a tool is also not neutral. It has specific demands. Every tool shapes the hand, as they say. So while a hammer is a tool to hit a nail into a piece of wood, it also demands that we configure our hand in a very particular way and move our arm in a very specific way for it to work. But more than just physical demands, a tool has ideological ones. In the context of capitalism, for example, a capitalist political economy rewards and incentivizes the pursuit of profit. Therefore, when it comes to developing tools, machines, and technologies, there's an incentive to develop ones that serve to grow profit margins, machines that are capable of increasing output while also lowering costs. In that sense, machines are not just useful, but ideological. They have an agenda baked into them. Being useful is not enough. A machine must be efficient. It can't just produce. It has to optimize. But I want to transition over to art. And of course, one could ask whether or not art is a tool. And if it is, what problems is it working to solve? If art is a tool, it's certainly a different kind of tool. The types of metrics that an engineer or a politician or a carpenter might apply to figuring out whether or not their tools are efficient don't necessarily apply to an artwork. No artwork is valued because of how well it fits into a standardized mold. In fact, we often value an artwork because it does the exact opposite of that, because it breaks from a standard. As a language, it's far too ambiguous or open-ended to be a reliable and effective communication tool. If I wanted to tell you something or communicate a particular message to you, pointing to this Picasso painting would probably not do a very good job at clearly communicating what I want to say. We don't appreciate an artwork because of how effectively it achieves a task or proves a point, but because of how convincingly it speaks to the paradoxes inherent to the human condition, how it inserts an interior expressive force into a shared public realm, how it resonates with deeply personal convictions, memories, sensibilities, many other reasons that I'm not going to list here. So in that sense, as a tool meant to solve a problem, I think an artwork isn't great. And even if it does, even if seeing an artwork can be a significant inspiration to some and become a force that can inspire and even mobilize political action or change minds, it won't do so reliably or consistently enough to be efficient in the way a hammer, a drill, a search engine, or a law can be. And yet, I think we can all agree, or at least this particular audience can agree, that art is still enormously valuable. So if art can break from the political and economic demand for efficiency and yet still be enormously valuable, then it might be a particularly useful space to think about in the context of imagining a world that is ruled by a different set of values, a place where efficiency is not king, perhaps even some kind of language that stands against efficiency. We all have our own reasons for being involved with art and for falling in love with art and for dedicating our lives and careers to working with art. And for me, speaking very personally, if I had to kind of boil it down to a really simple, very general sentence, it would be this. It's because art complicates. I like this formulation because it doesn't try to describe what art is, but what it does. In that sense, perhaps it describes what kind of a tool art is. And I'm interested in how to complicate something seems to stand in opposition to making something more efficient. So again, as I just said, all of us have very different reasons for being interested in art. And I'm not proposing this as some kind of universal formula of any type, but it's only a way of only to say that it's a way of thinking about art that has driven and informed my own personal work as a curator and my work with artists and with exhibitions and with institutions. Some see art, in fact, as a valuable tool for social change, as a way to bring transparency to injustices, and others, of course, enjoy it simply because it brings beauty and pleasure. For me, personally, however, art has always been so powerful and so valuable to my life because I find that it complicates everything it touches. It complicates what it might mean to call something beautiful. It complicates what it might mean to feel pleasure. It complicates what we might mean when we say injustice or social change. Its grammar is not the linear one that you find in rhetoric or logic, but is a paradoxical one that embraces contradiction and doesn't necessarily consider no to be the opposite of yes, or pro to be the opposite of con. It can allow complication and clarity to coexist. It takes something that is known about the world and makes it complicated again. It can even take something as simple as a square, an apple, a color, or a figure, things that we've seen a million times and think that we know everything about, and yet still make them complicated. I'm sure you've heard this phrase many times, or phrases like this. Artists don't solve problems, they invent new ones. This particular one is by Bruce Nauman, but I think we've probably all heard something like this coming from many people. And I wanted to take this one step further and to try a slightly different formulation, which would be to say, art turns problems into tools. I think that art does a lot more than just create problems, as if just for fun or just to be a punk or a troublemaker. An artwork can turn a problem into an opportunity for others. In my view, and again, I'm aware that many will have a different view here, but in my view, art is not in the problem-solving business. And by creating and inventing problems, an artwork opens a door or creates a tool that is then available to the world. How that tool is used, by whom, and to what ends is up for grabs. The French thinker Alain Badiou calls this an inesthetics, a way for art to insert a lack or a void into the fabric of the known, which can then be filled by politics or any other ethics or any other things. An artwork does not predetermine its effect, even if it might have a specific intention and if it embodies a specific point of view. But rather than being a tool that can efficiently solve problems, an artwork can be a problem that might inspire others to create an efficient tool. But I'm not going to just get lost in these generalities and these very larger-than-life statements about the nature of art, and I'm certainly not a theorist or a philosopher, but I want to go back and talk about tools in a more specific way. Because in a sense, I've tried to describe art, for me at least, as a complication machine, which inserts a productive paradox into the notion of the machine itself, because machines are usually developed in order to make a task less complicated, not more so. A machine, almost by definition, is a decomplication machine. And over the past 2 or 3 years, I've been thinking more about the machine and how it informs what artists do and how they think. Even the word machine sounds out of date. No one calls their phones or laptops machines. The word evokes heavy, greasy machinery made out of metal. So what is the machine in 2018? What does it look like? What does it do? What does it do to us? And where is the machine in art? Tools and technology have always played a role in determining what artists do and how they think, be it from the types of chisels used to cut stone and the advances in the way pigments are made, to how the digital space of the internet has transformed what it means to make an image in the first place. What are ways artists have made machines complicated? In the context of industrialization, attitudes and approaches have varied. From the arts and crafts movement in the late 19th century, which fought against the machine and tried to rescue traditional techniques. But then modernism took over, consuming with an appetite for speed and progress. The futurists loved the machine, the surrealists hated it. Marcel Duchamp imagined a new type of machine, a bachelor machine, in which mechanical forms were to be governed not by the rational laws of physics or engineering, but by the mental laws of subjectivity and desire. Jean Tinguely's machines demanded that they produce something irrational, or his famous homage to New York was engineered so that it would self-destruct. By the middle of the 20th century, Jackson Pollock showed how distant art could be from the mechanical, and then Andy Warhol proved how close it really is by literally calling himself a machine. By the 60s, as the machine was becoming less and less about steel and more about networks, and the first generation of conceptual artists began questioning the need for art to involve objects at all, and pushed away from materiality and towards systems, rules, and behaviors. At this point, several landmark exhibitions that marked and historicized the way the machine had been incorporated into works of art and how artists thought about their works of art. In New York, the Museum of Modern Arts showed the machine as seen at the end of the mechanical age, 1968, echoed both the optimism and the pessimism about our relationship to machines over the course of the 20th century. There was software at the Jewish Museum in 1970, and the Bachelor machine curated by Harold Zeman in 1975, which, and then more recently, building on Zeman's and Duchamp's question about where does the body end and where does the machine begin, there was the show Ghosts in the Machine at the New Museum in New York. Oh, sorry, these two. Yep. And then in the face of our hyper-efficient contemporary machines, the 2016 Berlin Biennial argued that machines could be pushed to accelerate even more, where blockchains, artificial intelligence, and brand managers could create something they called a post-contemporary that will be even more fluid and more flexible and faster until everything just collapses on itself. So last October, based on a lot of this research, I opened an exhibition called, of course, Mechanisms at the Wattis Institute in San Francisco. And I will soon be opening a kind of related exhibition to this called Other Mechanisms at the Secession in Vienna that opens in late June. My focus was less on the question of a body as a machine or the machine as a body, but more on the question of the machine as a tool. The title is important, not only because it moves from machine to mechanism, but also because it puts mechanisms, again, like I mentioned earlier, in the plural, mechanisms, or mechanism in more than one sense of the word. This comes from the idea that today, our machines are not only objects and devices, like mechanical mechanisms, but also more abstract mechanisms like administrative mechanisms, management systems, protocols, standards. I wanted to underline the ways in which machines are not just objects made of metal, but are also infrastructure, which makes them both much harder to see and recognize. Also, I wanted to play with the idea that people walking into a show called Mechanisms will probably expect to find a lot of kinetic sculptures running around the floor. And I chose to not include any of that kind of work because I wanted to think about how machines today don't necessarily come with on and off buttons or with plugs that can be unplugged. When you turn off your phone or your computer, very little about it actually is turned off. So here's a few slides of the show. Charlotte Pozanensky, sculptures from the late 1960s, point to the physical materiality of our invisible infrastructure, which is not as weightless or immaterial as one tends to think. An artist named Lutz Bacher, the installation of, these are surveillance domes. These are the domes that you would install in front of security cameras. So she does the reverse here by pointing to the tools that are used to hide machines, to hide surveillance machines. But of course, by doing this, they also become mirrors, which complicate who is looking at who. I also like how this particular arrangement creates a kind of mechanical starry night, where what we see when we look up in the sky might also be made of metal. The artist Louise Lawler plays with the ideas that plays with the ways that the parameters of things are adjusted, and how images can also be settings in both senses of the word. Her photographs take art that is from one setting and using a machine that is a camera, extracts it from one setting and places it in a different setting. But this new setting, in this case the Wattis Institute wall, is not, again, a neutral blank slate. This wall comes with specific dimensions and particular material constraints. So when I had told her the exact size of the wall, especially the kind of top curve that you see on the top of our ceiling, she then went into the settings in the Photoshop sense of the word, and what she calls adjusts the image to fit. DeFeo has drawings. These are drawings from the late 1970s of a series of tools. A tripod on the left, which is maybe the most recognizable. The next one is a Scotch tape dispenser, then swimming goggles, and then a shoe tree, a tool that you would put your shoe, keep its shape. This is a work by an artist named Cameron Rowland, and it's maybe the least visually remarkable, but is definitely the one that's generated by far the most conversation about in the show, and has more mechanisms in it than any other. So I think it's worth kind of going a little bit into detail about what's going on here. It needs a little bit of background information. So there are essentially two departure points here. The first is that in the United States during slavery, slave owners were able to buy insurance policies to cover their slaves. So in other words, insurance companies were making money off of slaves. A few years ago, a law was passed in the US that forced all insurance companies that still exist now to come clean, to admit and be transparent about the degree to which they had that kind of policy back in the mid-19th century. And Aetna is a major insurance company in the US, was one of the companies that said, yes, we sold insurance policies to slave owners to cover injury and death of their slaves. That's one part. The second part is every year there's a member of Congress, or until recently a member of Congress named John Conyers, who represented the state of Michigan, who every single year since 1989, he would submit the same bill to the US Congress for a debate. It's a bill called H.R. 40. And the way Congress works, you have to have enough of kind of what's called co-sponsors of a bill in order for the whole Congress to debate it. And Congressman Conyers' bill, it never had more than like 6, 7, sometimes 10 people who joined him. So it never even got debated, but every year, every January 1st, you would submit it again and again and again. And what the bill is a reparations bill. So if it does pass one day, essentially the American government would, one, apologize formally for slavery, and two, commit to figuring out how to measure and how to come up with a way of distributing reparation payments to all the descendants of slaves. So what Cameron did is two things. First thing, on the right here, he bought $10,000 of Aetna stock. So he bought 90 shares of Aetna stock at $110 a share. And this is just a graph that shows the purchase of that stock and its performance over the years. It's done very well since the 2 years since he bought it. It's already gone up about 40%. And it's fluctuating in the marketplace like normal. And then he's invented, now, of course, now we live in a time when Wall Street has invented all sorts of new types of tools and financial instruments, credit default swaps, and all sorts of tricks for money to make money. So Cameron has invented his own financial instrument, which is called a purpose trust. Most of you are going to know what a trust, a financial trust is, which is essentially a lockbox for money, where you put money and you lock it in a trust, and only particular conditions have to apply for people to be able to access that money, like your child has to turn 18 years old or whatever. So Cameron invented his own trust, and locked inside of the trust are these shares of Aetna stock. So those are, and the document on the left, you know, is the legal document that describes the conditions of the trust and what has to happen for those shares to be available. And essentially, the thing that would unlock the trust would be the passage of the bill in Congress. This is a real financial, this is not a fake art thing. This is like, you know, there's a significant amount of money locked, and, you know, if the bill doesn't pass for 100 years, there might be hundreds of millions of dollars kind of sit there, stuck there. The only reason they're not being made available is because the government is too racist to pass that law. There's all sorts of financial mechanisms, governmental mechanisms, legal mechanisms, racial mechanisms. There's a whole big knot being tied of a lot of different mechanisms in this particular artwork. Another one that's slightly related, it's hard to get a sense of scale here, an artist from Chicago named William Pope L., which brings together these two types of mechanisms. This is, maybe some of you recognize it, it's a drinking fountain, like a water fountain that's just been turned on its side. And this one is from the 1950s. So a drinking fountain is a mechanism in these two senses. On one hand, it's a water delivery machine. You know, you press a button and water comes out. So it's a machine and a mechanism in that sense. But especially in the 1950s in the United States, water fountains are very much also a segregation machine. It's a tool available to people to separate population based on the color of their skin. So a water fountain was one way in the civil rights era, where there would be one water fountain for white people and one water fountain for colored people, and that was just a way to separate people based on their skin color. So the water fountain is a kind of tool available for that. So in this sense, that how a machine or a mechanism is a mechanical device on one hand, but also, and kind of always, also a ideological device as well. Oh, keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. That's the water fountain up. You can see scale. These are works by the artist Jan Vo. These are 19th century animal traps. The big ones are bear traps, and that he bought at an auction. Now, one of the most dominant characteristics of the history of our tools and of our technology is the way that many new technologies are invented because we're always trying to come up with better ways to kill people. War lies at the heart of the history of technology. So I wanted in this show to have a moment in the exhibition where people encountered in a really raw and exposed way a just group of killing machines. That's what these are doing. We installed a second version of the Louise Lawler piece as a way to illustrate how, again, how if you change the settings, you need to change the settings. DeFeo, again, made a series of photocopied works in the mid-1980s. These are single photocopied sheets of a tissue box. It's hard to tell a little bit without having a close-up. I'm skipping over a range of different works, but these are etchings from 1949 by British artist Richard Hamilton called The Reapers, which are these kind of invented agricultural machines. This is a Canadian artist named Gary Neil Kennedy. He was invited to an exhibition in 1980 by this gallery, Eye Level Gallery, and he said, "Okay, thanks, give me your typewriter." Now, in 1980, that typewriter was that gallery's only way to communicate with the world. All of its correspondence, all of its invoicing, all of its shipping arrangements, all of its ability to communicate with the outside world was that typewriter. And so the artist says, "Please give me your typewriter." So they gave it to him, and he took a metal file, and he kind of filed down the bottom half of the lowercase letter E on that typewriter, the metal type, and gave it back to them. And then they continued using to do all of their letters and all of their normal stuff. But you saw earlier when I showed you the kind of press release text of our show, we essentially redid the work. We showed the two other interactions of the work, but then all of our press release, all of our wall labels, all of the exhibition pamphlet, all of it was done also with that same typewriter, and kind of inserting this inefficiency in this mechanism, a glitch being added to the mechanism of the typewriter that inserts this inefficiency in the mechanism of being able to communicate with the world. This is by Ahmed Farooqi. It's a part of a 12-screen installation, which turns the 2006 World Cup final between France and Italy into a kind of situation room, kind of a war-like situation room environment, and where what we know as the kind of invisible, beautiful game, so to speak, is put through the process of this kind of ruthless measurement and quantification technology of desperately trying to measure how many steps is this person taking and what's the angle that they're turning their head to the left or to the right, which makes sense if you're kind of preparing a battlefield maybe, but maybe makes less sense if you're trying to appreciate how beautiful of a game this is to watch. The new version at the session in Vienna is going to be different in many ways. It'll involve some of the same artists and some of the same artworks, but a lot of different ones, including these works by an Iranian sculptor named Nairi Bagramian, which are these huge abstract dentures, or again, tools you use to readjust or reset the parameters inside of your own mouth, but of course at this scale. Is abstracted, or these drawings and prints by an artist named Nina Cannell, which look like these beautiful abstract compositions, but they're actually taken from technical manuals that show a crosscut of various types of telecommunication cables. So those are that's one of the ways in which I wanted to talk about mechanisms, in the sense of how it's informed, how a mechanism, it could be a topic of an exhibition in this sense. But I wanted to connect this to a little bit of a larger conversation, larger mechanisms like exhibitions themselves as a mechanism, and then institutions, both of which are their own types of mechanisms, which come with specific standards and specific protocols and specific ideological demands. A group show, for example, is a very particular kind of complication machine. In my approach, I always try and make sure that the framework of a group show does not turn artworks into illustrations, but can complicate how we might read an artwork. For example, if the Yaniv Traps work were in an exhibition called Traps, it would certainly fit in that show, so to speak, but it wouldn't really complicate or add any new texture to how we understand Yaniv's piece, and it wouldn't really complicate or add anything to how we understand what traps are. So I would probably not include that work in a show about traps. And I would not include the Lutz Bacher piece in a show called Surveillance, or the Farooqi piece in a show called Art and Soccer, etc., all for the same reasons. A group show, for me, is not a didactic explanation machine, but can instead be a way to open up a space between an artwork and a frame so that visitors can find their own way to make a bridge between the two, ways which will, of course, always be different because all visitors are different, and come to it with a different perspective, a different knowledge base, different references. And I think this is what can help make an exhibition add up to far greater than the sum of its parts, and make each work in it more complicated rather than less so. But then there is this question of the mechanism that is the art institution. So we've kind of gone from very general thoughts on mechanism of how art works, at least again for me, and mechanism as a particular subject or topic for thinking about how to make a show, a particular exhibition. But then I wanted to end here with a look at the mechanism that is the art institution. And I've spent most of my career as a curator thinking not only about art and about artists, but also about institutions and how they can be made compelling and interesting types of complication machines for art. I'm not going to go too far back and go through too many examples, but I'll start with two. One, the Artists Institute, a small organization that I founded in 2010 in New York, and then the Wattis Institute, where I am now here in San Francisco. What both places have in common is this strange and ambiguous term, an institute, which, in my view, provides an opportunity to think about what kind of an institution that might refer to. What kind of a tool could that be? Again, what kind of a complication machine could it be, and what can it complicate? It's not a museum, not a gallery, not a center, not a school, but an institute. This word appears mostly in two contexts. There is the institute in the sense of the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, which is a public place, of course, for public exhibitions and public events. But then there's the institute as in the research institute, the institute in the academic sense, the Institute of Advanced Study in the university context, which is very different. It is actually usually a somewhat private place where a small amount of people gather together under the umbrella of a specific topic and stay together for an extended amount of time, like the Institute for the Study of Filipino Literature or the Study of Marine Technology or any other of the countless academic institutes. It's kind of a think tank, essentially. So for me, I think those two types of institutes have very different vocabularies that go along with them and ask for very different ways of working with artists that I've been very interested in pursuing. So I've tried to kind of complicate the mechanism that is an art center, an art institution, by structuring it around these two types of institutes and using these two types of institutes to work with artists in two very specific ways. On one hand, again, there is the ICA, which is about display, about exhibitions and display. And on the other hand, there is the think tank, which is about time and about attention, not necessarily about display. This is the Artists Institute. I know the name always makes people feel like it's a huge, palace, and it's actually a basement. When I found this space around in 2009, which is on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, it was perfect fit for the type of institution that I had in mind. To me, even this picture contains a lot. It looks like an institute in the think tank sense. It's small. It doesn't really have a front window. It's slightly removed by the street by a few steps. It's too small and the ceilings are too low for it to really be a proper gallery or display. It could not really do display very well. It cannot do the ICA thing all that well. It looked a little bit too removed and closed off for it to attract, of course, a large amount of people. But at the same time, it was public. It was not on the 10th floor of an academic building. It was on street level. It was on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, close to hundreds of other galleries and lots of art street traffic. And so it was, had this interesting play between being public, but public in a particular way. Ultimately, I wanted to create a place, an institute, where I could pay close attention to art. Not the way bloggers or many curators keep tabs on every new artist and every new thing and constantly seem to be trying to pay attention to everything. But I wanted to pay attention to a single artist at a time, perhaps even a single artwork at a time for an extended period of time, and to create a place for people who wanted to do that as well. To me, this image looks like that. It looks like a place where people were spending time with art, spending time with artists, spending time with artworks, with ideas, and of course, with each other. So I did something very, very simple, which was to divide the year into 2 6-month-long seasons and to dedicate each one to one artist and to show one artwork at a time. So 6 months is not actually a huge amount of time to spend with one artist, but at least it's longer than a traditional 6-week gallery show or even a 3-month-long museum show. And what I could offer an artist was a kind of tiny space, very little money, but a small but a very committed group of people who are going to spend 6 months thinking about their work, writing about it, talking about it, looking at it, and just paying very close attention to their ideas. And the goal for this was to be generative, that this one artist's work would open up a range of questions that relate to other artists, writers, musicians, thinkers, and that the program would be made up of this kind of expanded spiral of other people and ideas. This notion that this central artwork could be a departure point, that the goal of the season is not to somehow, again, explain what this artwork is, but to follow the life of its ideas, to complicate it in the sense by adding a series of detours and a series of other voices and perspectives to some of some of the themes and questions that are involved. So I'm going to go through now in a very, very accelerated slideshow to give you just a visual sense of what that looks like in this little basement. Oh yeah, this is the side. Just gives you a sense of the kind of size of the room. It's a little trick, of course, if you want to create a very popular event, just make sure the room can only fit, 45 people or so. We did a season with a French artist named Robert Filiou, Joe Bear, Jimmy Durham. Here's another single work by Jimmy Durham, drawing, sculpture. Rosemary Trockle, and Rosemary Trockle again, Rosemary Trockle. Haim Steinbach, Thomas Barley. And then, as I said, these are all kind of ways to this single departure point, or a set of questions and terms and ideas that a single artist like Robert Filiou kind of puts on the table, so to speak, is then picked up on and used as a kind of lens to think about art in a wider sense. What are ways in which similar vocabularies are used in different ways by other artists and other practitioners? So this is like a short summary of each of the seasons. This was Joe Bear, Jimmy Durham, and this just gives you a sense of kind of how each of these single figures becomes actually then a way to have a much more diverse and wide-ranging and full of contradictions and overlapping types of other artists and other voices across a wide range of disciplines. Haim Steinbach, Thomas Barley. Here are some images of what that looks like. So there's, again, I'm doing this very quickly. So, these are things, things around. Joe Bear was interested in light specifically and was an orchid collector, and we did this thing about ingrown orchids. This is this thing about painting and performance. Richard Serra film about color. Discussions with curators and art historians. There's Carolyn Christoph Bakar-Jeff and Jimmy Durham, who is acting like an apple tree in this case. Musicians, poets, meals. Jimmy Durham is one of the things that happened in that season was this question of invasive animals and how they tend to come uninvited to foreign lands and take over the waters and turn what was something that was exotic food into something much less so. It's a Beatrix Roof. Film, cinema, Susan Howe, again a thing around Emily Dickinson. We did a series of what are these called kind of close looking, which was very simple. We just said we had this problem for doing an opening because people would always say, oh, I have to come down and see your Rosemary Trockle show. And I would look at them and I would not say anything and I would think, okay, my Rosemary Trockle show, they're going to come all the way downtown, they're going to see one photograph on the wall. Like, to what degree is that a show, really? And there was something interesting I felt about how this whole system somehow complicated even what the hell is a show. And that felt like it was doing something interesting. But it was hard by the way, we showed one work at a time. We changed the work maybe once every 5 weeks or so. But then became this issue where it's like we have a new piece by Rosemary Trockle, but it just makes no sense to say, please come to the third opening of Rosemary Trockle, and you're going to take time, get on the subway, and it's raining, all the way there, and you're going to get there for your one picture. So we didn't really do that anymore, and instead we just said, we've put 15 chairs in front of a Rosemary Trockle photograph. We're going to, if you'd like to reserve a spot to just spend an hour looking at it, please do so. And so it was this kind of playing of trying to spend time with this thing rather than do a 6 to 8 wine reception, which just does not fit what this entire project is about. And so people did, and it was kind of incredible. We just looked at it for a long time. I think it started, this particular one started off, was maybe I'd say about 10 minutes of just stone silence, which is actually a pretty long time. And then someone said, I forget, something like, the more I look at it, it looks less like a spider and more like a stain or something. And then, everyone kept just started talking from there. But it was funny because the chairs were not in a circle, so everyone is just kind of like saying stuff, but all of us are looking at this image, you know. Sometimes we would combine this one artwork by Chaim Stambach with not an event, but with an actual installation by another artist. So this was on view for a month or so. And here's the same work or similar work with a different artwork by a different artist. Here's another one of these. Super fun. And this one we did slightly different things where we had 3 different days in a row and we assigned 3 completely different readings for each particular day. So one reading was about, you know, by an anthropologist about the lives of objects. And another one was about a kind of post-internet theorist about objects in a digital age. And anyway, and so depending on the kind of reading that you did, the nature of the conversation in these things would be very different, even if it was the same artwork. Thomas Barley, his work is about accumulation, and so he didn't want to do this one thing at a time. He just wanted every new thing that would happen, he wanted it to just accumulate and be installed on top of each other, and so the room just became messier and messier over the course of the 6 months. Yeah, here he installed thing on top of the wallpaper. Anyway, final performance. Anyway, that gives a sense of how that worked. You know, to me, this structure or this system or this mechanism was thinking about an institution kind of like as a story, you know, as something that grew and developed slowly and gradually, one work at a time, one event at a time, with kind of like in a story-like sense, with a main character who's there and who appears, but who also disappears and then reappears, and then a range of other characters that play a role in the story as well. So in light of that, I developed a very specific, I guess, tone of voice is what would be the way to say it, or a kind of mode of address to talk, you know, kind of a voice that I gave to the institution. Almost like a narrator. There would be this kind of constant narration of what was happening at the Artists Institute. So with every event, we would publish a new chapter with this narrator. So here's the, you know, we would have these pamphlets that would come out for every single event, and it was kind of a 6-page long kind of next chapter of the story. Here's a few other ones. Few first pages of few different stories of, you know, so it gives you a sense of the kind of, you know, this is not press release, this is not, you know, we are pleased to present a new performance by so-and-so. You know, that's not what this is about. This is much too, remember the basement image. No basement that looks that way is going to be proud to present a new blah, blah, blah by blah, blah, blah. It's just, that kind of a place doesn't really speak that way, or I thought so. It speaks kind of this way. And the scale, that kind of a basement scale, has also a scale of, you know, you're speaking to one person, you know, and you know, you don't tell one person that you're proud to present a new exhibition by, you say things like this. Oh yeah, here's the one for putting chairs in front of a thing. But just to give you a sense that there was also a kind of language layer, because again, thinking about an institution as a mechanism, you know, one of its tools inside there is, you know, how do you want to speak to your audience? What tone of voice, what mode of address do you want to use? And what does that say about the kind of place that you are? Oh yeah, here's a few others. We made a big book. Here's this huge book called Today We Should Be Thinking About, which brings together the first 6 seasons. And the book was all of those pamphlets and a lot more new writing. Again, with a general narrative thread that described everything from what the events were, but also what the reading, there's a private kind of research group involved in each season and what the readings we would do. So here we go, here's some examples. This is spreads from the book. So you see the sense of this, what I mean by a kind of narrated way of telling an audience what we're doing. This was a kind of narrated description of a particular live event that happened. Anyway, okay, so that's what the art. So I developed a lot of it. Continued developing a lot of this. I left New York almost 5 years ago, and have been doing under the main reason is that the Wattis Institute was essentially an opportunity to do this again, but with a lot more infrastructure and a lot more kind of stability. The secret about the Artists Institute was that it was very, very unstable, and I never knew whether it would exist in the following 6 months or whether I would still have a job or not. It was all very fragile. And the Wattis Institute became an opportunity to kind of be able to think in the same way, but with a bit more stability. So again, the Wattis is an institute in both senses of the word. It is an institute in the ICA sense, maybe more properly than the Artists Institute, where we invite artists to do exhibitions, and we display mostly new work. This is an exhibition by Laura Owens. I mean, the whole Mechanism group show that I just showed you, of course, is also in the Wattis galleries. But this is another view of the main room without walls built into it. But then the artists, the Wattis is also an institute in the think tank sense of the word, where in this case it's not 6 months, but we dedicate an entire year to a single artist as a subject of reflection and research and conversation. And we do that in a room that we built that's specifically designed to be a place for people and discussion and ideas, not for display. This is where we do our display, our ICA work, and this is where we do our think tank work, which is a bar that an artist named Oscar Tuazon made for us, and is clearly not a display room, because we're offering an artist something different. On one hand, we're offering an artist a gallery to display their work, and on the other hand, we're offering an artist 12 months of our sustained attention. And we will gather together in this room, an intellectual community in San Francisco, to look at their work, to talk about it, read about it, think about it, write about it, and again, look at it in a much broader set of practices through the lens of their work. And so, I mean, one thing I should specify, which I think is important, is that the artists that we dedicate this year to is not, you know, some kind of caged animal that gets analyzed to death like on a dissecting table by some group. But again, the work, or that central figure, provides more of the goal is for us not to all become experts in whoever that artist is. That artist's role there is really to provide a kind of thematic terrain, you know, or a series of, their work puts a series of questions or topics or subjects about the nature of art or the nature of the world kind of on the table, so to speak. And we spend a year working through those questions as they might relate to other artists, other fields, and kind of expand outwards from there. So it's really more about having an artist become that point of departure rather than the subject of kind of, you know, trying to figure it out and pin it down and analyze it. So, you know, for this kind of institute, for the Think Tank Institute, the form, the way to work with that artist is not via an exhibition, but in this case, a reading group, a series of public events, and then a publication. since 2014 when we started this, and so far we're on our 4th season now. We've worked with Joan Jonas, Andrea Fraser, David Hammonds, and now Seth Price. The way we talk about this at the Wattis, in terms of being able to identify these two aspects of our the two institutes, is on one hand we say Laura Owens is in the gallery, meaning her work is on display, and then we say, you know, Joan Jonas is on our mind, meaning the work is not on display. Joan Jonas is kind of our subject of a year's worth of our kind of research and discussion and events and essays. Maybe I'm going to just run over to the website to give you a last, and then I can stop and we can take questions. But just to give you a sense of what it looks like in the San Francisco version, rather than show can do. I'm always reminded of a colleague of mine who once described a good exhibition as one that can keep strange art strange. And I think that this way of working and institutions in general, exhibitions in general, aim, for me, in my own practice as a curator, aim to do that. So, thank you.
So much, Anthony, and that was one tool that did work, no? Huge fail. Anyhow, thank you, Anthony. If there are questions from, we have one. I think actually coming in there. Yeah, we do have mics on either side of the seats.
Hi, I actually have 2 questions. The first is the curatorial statement for the show called Mechanisms. You had the letter E's graphically without the bottom curve, and form is function. So I'm curious first why. I mean, it gives it a tick in a way visually. There's a tick in the text that animates it visually, but I'm curious if there's some other reason and where you found that typewriter key. And the second question is, if art is a tool to complicate issues or accepted conditions, it seems that its ideal utility is to trigger interrogation or the disruption of the ecology of things. But if we were to consider, for example, Cameron's insurance piece, it is a pretty clever way of being illustrative of how racism has found a way to mutate even after the civil rights movement. Ghettoization, the incarceration industry, et cetera, et cetera. But you said something about how, if the value of these talks, which are locked in this trust, becomes exponentially greater because the reparation law hasn't been passed, bill hasn't been passed, then, and you did say that it illustrates, it's reflective of the government being racist, but the government is, the people are also part of the government. Yeah. So where does civic engagement or civic complicity come in? It's, in a way, to say that it's only the government that's racist is like to give it the powers of l'état c'est moi, it's just them and we are powerless. Where is our agency? By the same token, with for example, the current Biennale here, a lot of the works kind of, comment on what's going on here, but until there's real civic engagement, things continue to unfold as they have.
Yeah, thank you for that. What could we go back to the? I think I can do it, right? We did a bad job in describing that one by going through a few too many examples, but the letter E is an artwork in the show. Let's see how far we can go back here real quick. I mentioned this artist, Gary Neal Kennedy from Canada, with this typewriter, so basically what that was on our, is we were showing an artwork, pre-existing artwork, called The Letter E from 1980 by Gary Neal Kennedy. And that work has a few different parts to it. One part is the institution that wants to show that work uses this typewriter that has, so this is the first time he showed it in 1980, where this gallery said, oh, we want to do a show, and he's like, yeah, sure, I'd like to show this piece called The Letter E, which means give me your typewriter. And he gave it to them, and he took a metal file, and he opened that typewriter, and he physically, so the way, this notion of that, something as abstract and immaterial as like communicating with the world has, in this case, of course, this deep connection to the metal bit that he was able to remove part of, to not break the machine. That the typewriter, of course, here is not broken. It completely continues to function like a normal typewriter. But it has been inserted, there's something that's been done to it that kind of adds a problem to the way in which that tool can perform the task of communicating to a reader. Not by not making it impossible, by making it, by placing a bit more demands on reading it. It slows down, it's just harder to get through somehow. I should mention, actually, going back to this work, that the work has 3 different mechanisms. It has an intervention on a typewriter, which therefore has a consequential intervention on kind of how an institution can communicate with the world. All of its messages to the outside world have to be done via this kind of inefficient, not broken, but altered machine. But also comes with a requirement of a staged photograph, which in his mind he wants to also include the mechanism that is the management of the organization in the work. So this is the photograph of him holding the little piece of E, sitting with the head of the organization, the director of the eye-level gallery, so the person responsible for managing the place, as well as 2 members of the people responsible for funding the place, so the financial mechanisms of that organization. So when we redid this piece, you can't see it, it's too small here, but we did that. So there I am on the far left as the director of the institution, and there's Gary, and there's 2 of our main patrons for our show that, again, had to pose for this photograph of the kind of physical. But we just executed this artwork from 1980, and the ingredients are stage that picture, use this typewriter for in all the formats that your institution speaks to the world. You need to use this typewriter. So people ask if we cheated. So all of our labels and brochures, and we did not cheat. Our designer did not design a digital font that doesn't have the bottom of the E. We wrote everything on the typewriter, scanned it, sent it to the designer to be placed in the book, wherever. All of it was done manually, and adding this kind of unnecessary inefficiency to our own ability to communicate with our audience. Yeah. The other question about Cameron's work, no, yeah, I mean, I don't want to, that particular artwork, 2 things. One, it's a particular aspect of his work, in this case, not one that relates to his interest in incarceration and prison labor. That's a whole different body of work that Cameron has done, and that's not this one. This particular one, yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to rush and to say that in any way is this an attempt to blame a single entity or a single set of individuals for some kind of thing that they're doing wrong. I think, as you said, part of what, government is nothing other than the people that made it, make it. And so the fact that this particular bill would not pass, or maybe it will pass, but the fact that it hasn't yet passed says something about the kind of people that the American population are to vote for the representatives who would be people who would choose to not pass this H.R. 40. I guess except for the people who voted for Congressman Conyers, who keeps submitting it every single year no matter what, and he certainly believes in it. So some people in the government believe in it. But going to this notion of civic, Cameron, I think this particular artwork makes it, I think, clear that the power of it, for me at least, is situated not in its ability to right a wrong in some way, right? Or to kind of prove a point in some kind of soapbox direct message way. But it's really to kind of tie a knot and make a whole series of realities, of prejudices, of governmental mechanics, of bureaucracies, of protocols. There's so much things going on in there that are a huge block of both from everything from ideology all the way down to like administration via, again, financial tricks that people inventing tools for money to be able to work in ways that are kind of manipulative, and Cameron doesn't really created any of those, right? All he's done is be able to draw the lines around and create a kind of problem inside of them, something that is a completely, almost like the typewriter in a way. He's making a financial tool that is completely functional in the same way that the typewriter is not broken. He's not breaking the government. He's not tearing anything down. He's not, because I think that he's not saying that that's necessarily what an artist can do, or that he's one that he might want to do. That an artist is not, that what an artist can do though is to kind of, by tying a knot with something, what I think one thing that it ends up doing is that the process of untying it and trying to untie what this mess is, the process of doing that tells you a lot about why is the knot there in the first place? What are all the forces at stake that make it so that that's just a big, messy, beautiful, complicated knot in there. And so I think he's able to create a kind of machinery, a mechanism, in this case a real financial instrument, because that's just really what it is, that is just sitting there, able to, fully enabled and having the agency of being a legally enforceable document that should this happen, this value, whatever his portfolio is worth at the day that bill passes, that is a legal, talking about agency, like he is equipping himself with the legal document that will force all of that Aetna stock, value of a company that made money off of slavery, that money made out of the stock market of stocks of that company, that money will have to and can only be spent in the context of a law that's about distributing payments. So I would argue, is inserting an ability to be able to somehow enforce a particular value in that sense, but not so much that he's still putting it in a place where it is susceptible to forces larger than just him, because by definition, all of us are susceptible forces that are larger than just us, and we don't exist and act and will in a vacuum. And so he's not also saying, I think we should all, an artwork is not just, for him it's not just, we should all send money out to all of the descendants of slaves, because what is that going to do for him to say that out loud? Instead, he can create a system or this kind of weird problem or complicated financial tool that would actually do that, but and point to the fact that the reasons why it might not happen are reasons that are on the responsibility of all of us as a society, I guess. It's a long-winded way of speaking to it.
Exchange mics with you, so this can go around. So thanks, Karina, for that. So are there any questions? Oh, Maria? Was that? Yes. Are there any questions from the up there? Okay. Then I'll ask one of my my own. No? So when you were thinking of creating these institutions where you actually had the time to engage with whether it was one piece of artwork or one piece of, or an artist, and how this developed in your thinking, how do you think it has actually perhaps served your practice as a, maybe you don't want to call it a practice, as a curator, and how it served your consideration of other models, for example?
I mean, you know, the first thing is that it's done. For me, is you know, if you spend a year kind of in a particular artist's world and ecosystem, I mean, for me, you just learn an enormous. I've learned an enormous. I mean, I learn from artists. I think the whole world should just learn from artists much more than it does, but learning, like in school, like anywhere, takes time, you know, and takes attention. And I found that the most rewarding ways in which I've been able to learn about art or about ideas, about the world in general, about myself, is by spending as much time as I can with artists, not only individually and personally, but with the things that they make and the ideas that they bring forward. And so for me, it's been really kind of inspiring and productive in terms of being able to be an incubator for my own ability to think about art and to think about myself as someone working with art, having been able to have this extraordinary luxury of spending these kind of working with one artist at a time, whether in these year-long seasons or even in the solo shows. Even if it's a 3-month exhibition and a normal show of display, it's still not a group show with 20 artists, which I do very, very rarely, because if you do a big group show with 20 artists, you can't really spend that much time with each of them. And by working with one artist at a time, I found that I've just been able to get a much, you know, not in a kind of instrumentalized way, not because I'm looking for a particular set of things out of it, or, oh, if I work with this person, I'll learn X, Y, Z. Not at all. It's really more like, you know, it's just more trusting that artists are going to constantly see the world a way that I don't, and surprise myself, and that's something I hope to be able to share. And you know, allow as many other people as possible to kind of be delighted in that same way, and be excited and be inspired by, you know, surprising different other perspectives that exist. So for me, it's been really an important one that defines kind of how I move forward. I just rely on that contact and dialogue with artists and that proximity to them and what they do, and a kind of sustained commitment to it has been really important. You know, in terms of how it relates to other models, I mean, I think one thing I didn't really mention explicitly, we spoke about the other day, and that maybe relates to this context here, is that the reason I started thinking about this institute in these two different ways was not completely in a vacuum, not just because like institute means two different things. It was because both the Artists Institute and the Wattis Institute, just like MCAD, are both institutions that are operating under the umbrella of a university. The Artists Institute operates under the kind of umbrella of a Hunter College, part of the City University of New York, and the Wattis Institute operates under the umbrella of a place called California College of the Arts. And so I was thinking a lot in terms of models, in terms of like, you know, okay, if I'm trying to create a place for art and a place for curatorial work, not at, you know, ICA London or something, or not at, you know, the Museum of Contemporary Art of, you know, Denver or something, whatever, nothing about any of those places being bad or less interesting, but there's a specificity to the context that I was thinking about, which is, what does it mean to create a place for art and curatorial practice from the particular perspective of being out of a university context? Like, how do you think about working with artists on when on one hand, what you want to do, because you're interested in exhibitions, is to work with artists by displaying their work. But you're doing it in a place, a school, which by definition is not about display. It's about thinking and learning. And so how do you kind of bridge a place that's, an exercise that's about display, but bring it together with and connect it with a way of working with artists that's more in line with thinking and learning. And so that's kind of was my cue to say, well, an institute in both of these senses opens a door to be able to work with an artist in these two ways. On one hand, to show their work in a room and give them money and square feet and whatever, visibility to put their work on display and to be an ICA in that sense. But then to also do this other way, this think tank way, and to do that other way, again, not just because it's cool, but because we're connected to a school. So therefore, we should try to think about ways to work with artists that are not just about display. We should try to think about ways to work with artists that are more in line with, like an academic think tank. So let's just say, instead of the Institute for Marine Technology, let's just say, for the next year, we're going to be the David Hammons Institute. And everything that comes out of this room, every event, every published essay, every email is all going to come out of that institute. Therefore, its set of concerns are going to somehow be informed by the questions and problems and ideas that this one artist kind of puts on the table, so to speak.
Thanks. Any questions? If that's the case, then
No,
yes, someone. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I was curious what inspired you to have one artwork, and was curious if you know Mario Diacono, because he had a space with one artwork often.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know of him, but I don't know him. It's really very simple way to answer that question. It's really the size of the room. I mean, maybe it's hard to see in the pictures exactly how small this room was. But it's the kind of room that if you put one photograph in it, it was totally fine. It in no way felt like an empty room. It was that, so I was like, I'm always someone who, like, when you have a problem, the best thing to do is to exaggerate the problem, like always, and so in this case, it was like, let's turn the fact of how kind of undisplay worthy of a room this is into, let's make that as material as possible, and like not try to pretend that this is and let's just make it, if it's tiny, let's just make it, it's so tiny that all we can do is show this one thing, and just kind of exaggerate it in that one, and that's really why. But it also fit this, sense of in a kind of funny way, of a think tank, right? Of just kind of this almost over-the-top, extended duration attention on kind of a specific, smaller range of things. It worked very well in the in the Lower East Side of New York, where it's filled with all these galleries who are always doing so many, there's like thousands of artworks within a few block radius of all these, the next cool young thing is always there, and it's always dynamic and exciting. And then you walk into this basement and there's like one photograph by a major artist who should be having a retrospective at the Met, not a show in the Lower East Side, and it was this funny, it was another way of trying to like pull it, separate what we're doing and the kind of energy of what it was from all of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Anything else before we close the talk? Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Anthony.
you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Just to inform everyone, we'll have the next 3 speakers coming for the rest of the year. We don't know. We'll be giving out the dates by next 2 weeks. Thank you very much, everyone.